Well, it allowed for a lot of subtlety. You know, when you have, imagine like a musical score, when you have two lines, you can create counterpoint, harmony between them. And a lot of these echoes happen in the reader's mind. They're not, they're suggested to her, but they're not asserted. And I think this allows for the reader to have her own active involvement in creating the story, the meaning. It's much more emotional. I think it just allowed me a more dimensional novel than if I would have only told one of these stories and not the other. Yeah, so he is one of the characters for sure. He's a kind of guiding ghost in many ways, particularly in Nicole's section of the book. I think each of them approach these ideas from a different direction, and they meet in the middle in many ways. But Epstein is masculine. He's 68. He's at a different point in his life. He has his story is told in the third person. Nicole is younger. She's female. She's much more contemplative. So they each allow me access to different kinds of observation, comedy, difficulty, meditation. So I wanted all of these possibilities. I wanted to approach these ideas from all of these angles and not be just bound to one or two of them. I think you're right that in each of these cases, story of Kafka in this book, Nicole and Epstein, we have three ways of looking at people who have a narrative of their lives. In the case of Kafka, it's after he dies, the narrative that we have of Kafka. We could talk about that later. But that narrative in this novel seems no longer to fit them. There's an inaccuracy, potential inaccuracy there. There's a narrowness. There's a lack of freedom. Mm-hmm. And in each case with Epstein and Nicole, there's a late blooming of a desire to alter this narrative of the self, to blow it open, to give more freedom. And this is the nature of their transformation, and it involves a kind of spirituality. I love the idea of reading it like that. There's so many ways to do it, but the book is undoubtedly playing with the idea of what is real and what is imagined, and it's trying to turn these ideas on their head. It's asking the reader what you see and you take every day as the laws of reality. Are they laws? Is this reality true, or is that reality an invention, a perception? Is your reality something that can be altered? Is it a reality that is it the only one? And the book is constantly at play with those ideas. I think the idea is that we, many of us, if not all of us, have divided selves, which is to say that we can feel fundamentally here in our lives as we know it, and yet we imagine ourselves into other lives constantly, and we're also aware of all of the shadow lives that we could have lived. So, for example, you know that at one point in your life, when you were 19 or 25, you turned right in your life, and that right turn led to many, many things that determined the rest of how you were going to live. But you could so easily have turned left, and you know that if you turn left, you can actually see what your life might have been like. And that left turn never exactly leaves you, that left-turned life. And it lives with you in some way, along with all the other possibilities. We are always caught between choices that we make and what seems like the fate of our lives, and the question of what role we play in determining who we are, what our lives are going to look like. Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that we all long for access to this sense of the infinite. We know that we live these finite lives, and yet there's something in us that also is aware of that infinite possibility, and we want to touch it somehow. I think that's why we go to literature, that's why we go to poetry and art, because there we find it again. At the end of a sentence of Kafka, you find yourself at the edge and you look out and there's the infinite, and it takes your breath away, But the question is, how do we seek that out in our lives? How do we let the possibility of that, or the knowledge of that, enter in our lives, rather than turning always toward what is fixed, finite, final, and already decided? Yes, there is this, there's an idea early on in the book in which she's listening to a radio program about the multiverse, and her mind begins to run with this idea, not just that there could be many different versions of the universe with totally different laws, physical laws, laws of being, but also that there could be different universes where the same self exists, but slightly different. And I think, again, this, I don't think I'm unique in this way, and to have this longing for more life. Who doesn't want more life, more chances, more possibilities, rather than this one singular existence? I'm not sure. I would need to hear more about that theory, but there's this idea in the book that how is it possible that right at the opening of Genesis we have these two different stories of the creation of the world, and why? What does that mean when the redactors put the Bible together? What were they trying to tell us? And there's this idea which seems almost blasphemous, which is that, well, when God created the world, there were many ways to create the world, and when we as human beings choose one way of beginning, even we are aware of all the other possibilities. And in the case of this Bible, all the other Abrahams and Moseses and Davids that could have existed, and there's this sense of the loss of that infinite possibility. But we, in some sense, we have to give it up when we create, because the first stroke we make on the canvas, the first sentence we write, we're already limiting ourselves. We're already entering into this sense of what is finite. But then it's also the beginning of a world, the creation of a world. Well, I think that we're so afraid of formlessness as people. We cling so desperately to form and shape and narrative and structure. But there's a beautiful idea in the book that comes from this mystical rabbi from the 16th century, Rabbi Luria, and it's the idea of tzimtzum. Well, tzimtzum is a concept that came in answer to the following question, which this rabbi posed. How is it possible that the infinite, the Ein Sof, which in Hebrew means the being without end, could create something finite? And his ingenious answer to this was, well, first God had to withdraw himself. He had to contract to create a void, and only in this void then could the world be created. And I think that this echoes with what's happening to Epstein and Nicole, that in order to become something else, they have to first, yes, rest, they have to occupy this, sustain uncertainty, they have to withdraw and create this kind of void. And this is not an easy thing to do. It's a difficult thing, particularly for people who have filled their lives with presence. In the case of Epstein, with materiality. In the case of Nicole, with decisiveness about who she would be, what she would do. But there's this necessity of contracting for a while in order to become again. Well, for the last name of Epstein, there's this importance that it be a name. Do you remember the scene when Rabbi Klausner comes up to him in the Bible and says, "Do you know your name Epstein?" It's one of the few names that go back all the way to King David. And believe it or not, there really is a list of names that certain Jews believe are connected directly to the lineage of King David. So names like Dayan, like General Moshe Dayan, or Abravanel. There's, I don't know how many of these names, 25 of them. And I wanted a name that was connected to that. And Epstein is such a funny one. It's on this list because it really does sound like you're just a classic shtetl name. But the moment that this rabbi comes up to Epstein and says, "You know, your name goes all the way back to David," he laughs at first. Epstein laughs because it seems so absurd. But bit by bit, in the way that happens to us with stories that we hear, that we feel we're connected to, the story of King David begins to settle into him. And who was David? David was this manipulative, cutthroat, warring, but very, very attractive and beloved character. Like Epstein, somehow recognizes the connection, the mirroring. But what does David have that up until that point Epstein lacks? Well, David was supposedly the author of some of the most beautiful poetry ever written, the Psalms. And so there's this notion of grace. And Epstein sort of lacks that grace. It's that grace that he is stumbling toward, grace in the idea of knowledge which comes back to us after it's gone through the infinite. And so he begins, I suppose, unconsciously to move toward that other part of his namesake's story. So that name was critical to me. And then as for Jules, sometimes things come just unconsciously, but I remember very, very early on, I had this thought, often nothing from the end or later in the book is known to me, almost nothing, but I'll have a tiny little detail or something that I'll hold on to. And I knew, of course, that Epstein was going to disappear in the desert. And I had this image or this oral echo of him being lost and people calling for him, people calling his name and saying, "Jules, Jules, Jules," out in the desert. But then the name would reverberate back off the desert hill as Jews, Jews, Jews.